The approach of a Land Rover was always of interest. Often it meant George the provider and food. But this time there was a touch of excitement in the air. Christian was especially interested, no doubt by the scent of the new lions. George wasn't sure what his reactions would be, or boys', or for that matter, his own, when the time came to meet them. From the warmth of Christian's greeting, it seemed I'd chosen well. Perhaps it wouldn't be so difficult. Ladies to gentlemen is always an easier introduction. At first, anyway. I must admit that just for a moment, I felt like some shameless procurer engaged in feline slave traffic, bringing suitable concubines for regal pleasures. It's no good being the king of animals unless you're treated like one. Christian, the young prince, just couldn't believe his good fortune. Mona and Lisa behaved according to the roles I'd given them, and were suitably provocative in their attitudes toward Christian. But with wire between them, Christian knew it was just a waste of time. But wire there must be for several days yet. George too must wait. And there's no better place than bed for making friends and influencing people. Mona and Lisa were unusual. They weren't exactly wild, like Juma. But they weren't exactly tame either. For several months they'd been stared at by thousands of visitors to the orphanage. They'd lost their fear of man, but that was all. They needed to get used to the sight, smell, and the sound of George's voice. The more friendship, the more you can control, and then the easier it is to shepherd them through the various stages of rehabilitation. Christian didn't like this unequal sharing out of George's favors. He was jealous and made an extravagant fuss of George, hoping to win his attention. If only Christian had realized. His caresses were double-edged. His rough, rasp-like tongue can remove hair and bring blood to the surface of the skin. George was bowled over by these terrible demonstrations of affection. What would happen if there was no wire? George debated for several days. Then, quite suddenly, he decided he had to find out. It was best to make some action they'd seen before, many times. So instead of giving them water through the wire, he took it in. This was the first time they'd ever had direct contact with humans. When they tried to bite, George simply told them to stop. They were surprisingly gentle considering the circumstances of their early life. Their parents had been shot as man-eaters. After such an unexpectedly good reception, George felt it was safe to let Christian into their compound. But their friendship had now been superseded by a desire to protect their territory, and as Christian hadn't been sharing it, he found himself no longer a prince, but a pauper. It was all very confusing for him with his attitude of make love, not war. Best to forget that, try another approach, thought George, and with Terence's help, Christian made a quick but rather undignified exit. Boy has had a lot of experience with young lionesses. He's usually generous, and the territory was his. Unfortunately, he left a scrap of meat around, and that started things off on the wrong foot. But Boy wasn't going to lose his composure over a couple of females, however beautiful. He didn't need to demonstrate. He knew he had the power, and it wasn't his nature to be vicious. As Mona and Lisa grovelled at Boy's feet, Christian and Juma watched open-mouthed at this majesty. What had he got that they hadn't? George and I talked about the little cub at the orphanage, but another male was out of the question. When he arrived and let out his first full-blooded growl, George realized he was exceptional. And from that moment, he was called Super Cub. If you don't want a big protest, you have to pick up lion cubs like babies, with complete confidence. Christian was allowed to meet him. George remembered how patient and gentle Christian had been with Catania. It wasn't long before they were playing together, as though they'd been close friends all their lives. Even Boy was completely undone by this mighty mouse-eater. When at last we could contribute nothing more to their well-being, George opened the gate to freedom. Juma, the wild one, scooted out first. She now occasionally visited Boy's compound, but only at night. George was now completely accepted by Mona and Lisa. They seemed fascinated with his well-scratched legs. The expression of their newfound liberty knew no bounds, and as the rains had just broken, there was a feeling of celebration in the air. For all that is except Boy. He seemed reserved and detached with all except Christian. It seemed that the terrible treatment Boy had received from the wild lions had upset him more than we'd thought. He lacked trust and needed constantly to be near his old friend, George. To lean a little on their old friendship, or just to be alone. The rest of them chose to play in the freshwater pools, and Super Cub got his formal christening. no one ever disturbs a sleeping lion. No one, that is, except a super cub. George was worried by Boy's rejection of Super Cub and the others. He carefully removed a tick, then tried to console his old comrade of so many years. The story of the tragedy cannot be more truthfully told than in George's own words.
Early on the morning of the 6th June, I had taken Christian and the lionesses out for a walk to a hill about a mile away from camp, where I left them to spend the day. Boy had been away during the night and had not accompanied us on the walk. I returned to camp about 10 a.m. and was having a late breakfast. My cook, Kimani, came into the hut and said that Boy had just arrived. In fact, I could hear him drinking at the water trough outside the compound wire. A few minutes later, Kimani had come in to clear the table, when suddenly both of us heard cries from the bush behind the camp. At this instant, I realized that Boy had attacked someone, probably my assistant Stanley. I knew that there was nothing left for me to do other than to shoot Boy. I grabbed my rifle and ran to the back gate of the compound. I saw Boy with Stanley in his jaws. As I rushed at him, he dropped Stanley and moved further into the bush. I ran a few paces past Stanley and shot Boy through the heart. In a few moments I was back with Stanley and shouted to Kimani to help. Together we supported him and tried to walk back to camp. But after a few paces, Stanley collapsed. I got my car and we took him to my hut and laid him on the floor. He was unconscious. As I started to examine his wounds, he died.
It seemed that Christian sensed George's sorrow and remorse at this double tragedy. He was usually there on the rocks at sunset when George wandered up to sit for a while, to take stock of life.